Good morning, everyone. I realize we're between you and lunch, so we're going to make it extra special, this panel today. And it's on the topic of gendered globalization, and we have a very esteemed and interesting panel in the preparation room. I discovered what they're going to talk about, and I think there will be plenty of Q&A. So I've asked the panelists to keep their remarks to 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm sure the panelists will forgive me if I remind them when we get to 5. And I'm going to start by giving a couple of opening remarks, partly based on my own experience, but also drawing from the latest information. I'm the CEO of a foundation that invests very significantly in girls' empowerment. We're a children's-focused foundation, so we look very much at the girl child. And I'm constantly inspired by the young women and girls that I meet. The girl at the back of the class who puts her hand up and asks a killer question, who wants to be a prime minister or a policewoman in her village. And those girls really are the future. And they're not just the future for themselves or their families. They're actually the future of global politics and the global economy. McKinsey has estimated that if every country achieved full gender equality, global GDP could increase by a third. That's 28 trillion. Closing the gender pay gap in the UK and US alone would add 10% to GDP. And the IMF says that countries with greater gender equality are more diversified, have higher productivity growth, and much lower levels of income inequality. They also crucially spend a lot more on education and the development of human capital, which are in and of themselves huge contributors to growth. So investing in women, generating equality and equal opportunity for women is essential at every level, whether it's property laws, whether it's access to finance, whether it's access to contraception so that young women can control their fertility and enter the workplace and choose how many and whether they want to have children. But we still have a very sad picture globally. If you look at the rates of labor force participation across the G20, there are a number of countries that are still between 25 and 30% gap. And in fact, India, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia are at the bottom of the pile in the G20, with labor force participation gaps approaching 50%, 60% in Saudi Arabia. And the gender gap, the gender pay gap remains incredibly high, and again, India across the G20 is at the lower end with Japan and Korea, with very significant gender pay gaps of 30%. But there's much work to be done across the entire G20 in terms of access to finance to start a business, access to training to start a business. Based on survey data, very few women are having the same opportunities as men. So when women achieve economic empowerment, it will change the way that the girl child perceives her chances, and it will also change the way the girl child is perceived by her families. And we will spend a lot of time talking about equality at the top. There are more men named John who are in the C-suites of FTSE 100 companies in the UK than there are women. And we will also talk at women at the bottom of the pyramid who are robbed of many life chances and autonomy. But we mustn't forget the women in the middle who will be significant agents of growth. And I hope that we'll have an opportunity to talk about access to affordable and quality childcare, parental leave, and so on. And I'll leave you with my own personal story. One of the first things I did when I became CEO of my organization was to equalize maternity and paternity leave. And I called out for a round of applause, the first man to take 3 months paternity leave in our organization. And now most of the young men, when they have their first baby, are taking 3 months off. And I'm pretty sure that will transform not only their happiness, but also the happiness of their families and the life chances of their children. So I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, Åsle Toje. Over to you. Åsle Toje is on the Nobel Prize Committee and is Norwegian and is going to give us a Scandinavian perspective. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Speaking as a man who took paternity leave, I took paternity leave with all 3 of my kids, and I took 3 months with my youngest daughter. And after 3 months, my youngest daughter was calling me daddy and her mother Anne, which of course was a great pain for my wife. It only took a few weeks and she became mommy again, but it's highly recommended. Globalization and equality among the sexes are in many ways 2 sides of the same question. And I think what we see today is that globalization in many quarters have become a bit of a bad word. To lend and to borrow from Ralph Dahrendorf, the great sociologist, it seems that we are reaching a point where good things turn bad, or if not bad, then stale, where attempts at instituting a final form of justice or liberalization is resulting in something that by many is experienced as a new kind of bondage. Globalization is an issue that is controversial in different parts of the world for different reasons. In Europe and in the United States, the questions of migration are high on the agenda, whilst in a country like India, the questions are rather different. It's fascinating and it's interesting to be here in India now, the fastest growing economy in the world. I do believe in my heart that we are at the beginning of a 30-year growth spurt for India, that India is about to experience its 30 glorieuses, its glorious 30 years, just like France before it, just like Japan before it. But in this, there is a question, I think, that India will need to deal with, and that is the question of women and of equality, where still today in India, girls receive significantly less education than boys. And of course, these are issues that will not be surprising to anybody in the audience. There are a great many issues on the political agenda here in India. Take it from, for instance, the Me Too movement with the actress Tanushree Dutta, and currently in the media now, the Sabarimala temple in Kerala, where they have refused access to women, and now 2 women access the temple. All of these issues have in common that there is a reluctance in the society that is experiencing great changes. I've come to India for about 30 years, and in the last 5 years, the changes have been massive. And these changes also tear at the fabric of Indian society, and India is a very old place. It's a very advanced and very old civilization, and this civilization also plays into the roles of men and women. And it's difficult, I'm not going to lie to you, it's difficult for a country such as India to see the social transformations that accompanies globalization and growth. And I think when we look at Thomson Reuters Foundation last year put out statistics where they showed that India was the country in the world that was the most dangerous for women, violence against women. It's an indicator that something is amiss. I think if India is going to be able to unlock its inherent potential, it will need to bring women into the workforce in a much bigger way than is currently the case. But in order to make this happen, a cultural shift is necessary. And I think that cultural shift is one that we've seen in Western countries, I think maybe in Scandinavia more pronounced than many other places. And it's, of course, the tagline is equality amongst the sexes, but it's something much more profound. It's how women are viewed, how women view themselves. And I think if India manages to take some steps away from the paternalism that has been prevalent in much of the discourse, and I think many women experience in their daily lives, where either they're seen as somehow subordinate to men, or somehow individuals that need somehow to be protected from themselves and from society, and moving towards a view that is prevalent, I believe, in Scandinavia, where women are seen as people, as individuals, that sex doesn't really come into that question. It's your abilities that matters in a work situation. And that's, I think, is where India needs to go. If there's one single issue that I believe developing countries such as India need to pay attention to, it is the question of education of women. A couple of years back, Malala Yousafzai and Kailash Satyarthi received the Nobel Peace Prize. And in her Nobel speech, Malala was talking about the 400 million girls who are denied education in this part of the world. And I think this is the single one issue that needs to be remedied. Without education, I don't think equality is possible. And that, I think, is the main suggestion that I would put towards people in this country, is that the broken education system needs to be remedied. And I think that through education, gradually, slowly, and surely in an Indian way, resulting from a dialogue within the nation, the shifts, the small steps towards greater equality will be made. Thank you.
Thank you, Oslo. We're now going to move to Farah Isfahani, the esteemed author and also a former member of parliament from Pakistan. Interested in your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm a bit soft-spoken, so I just check. I really today want to talk about the political empowerment of women, which I think actually is the most crucial part of getting a truly engendered globalization effort going forward. And I also want to say I don't feel entirely comfortable about the North saying that the Scandinavian countries are fantastic and India, has all these problems of patriarchy. I think it's a mixed bag. And I don't think we should bring our own cultural issues or feelings to the table. I live in America. Last week in Washington, D.C., we were celebrating the historic fact that 100 women had been elected to the US House of Representatives. However, that is less than half of what proportionality demands. So even in the West, all of us are still part of this fight for gender equality. All of us are in the same fight. So I don't think it's useful to do a north-south or who's right, who's wrong, and who's good and who's bad. I think all women across the world at different degrees face these issues. So when we discuss gendered globalization, we need to contextualize it in the past 50 years of globalization. Today, we have a far more mobile population, but the inherent and historic biases remain. Only 100 years ago, women did not have the right to vote, even in Western Europe and North America. Today, almost in every country around the globe, women do serve as presidents, prime ministers, ministers, and legislators. Women are part of the armed forces, police forces, and peacekeeping forces. At the same time, women's participation in the workplace is certainly not on an equal footing with men. A quote I use sometimes is, each step forward can be followed very quickly by someone trying to pull a woman back. Happens every day. Even in the field of gender equality, on the one hand, more of us are at the table today, absolutely. I look at Minister Irani, I'm sitting here, and Kate here, CEO of her own company, doing such good work. I mean, that is fantastic. Recently in Pakistan, I think, on Women's Empowerment Day, the panel was 9 men. So, thank you, Samir Saran, for this. So even in the field of gender equality, on the one hand, more of us at the table. On the other hand, there are not enough of us at the table proportional to our numbers. and most importantly and very worrying is the fact that it does not take very much to reverse progress, as we have seen in many parts of the world recently in terms of racial, ethnic, and religious biases, which have returned to the forefront of justice issues after decades of progress globally. After World War II, we did not think that the kind of from anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all of these issues we're seeing today, we thought these were resolved issues on their back. So what I'm trying to say about properly gendered future globally is be positive, move forward, but one step at a time, because it can slip in the blink of an eye with one populist leader. When it comes to political and economic leadership, as I said, the world still has a long way to go. Across the 149 countries assessed by the World Economic Forum for their 2018 Global Gender Gap report, there are only 17 that currently have women as heads of state, while on average, just 18% of ministers and 24% of parliamentarians globally are women. Similarly, women hold just 34% of managerial positions across the countries where data is available, and less than 7% in the 4 worst performing countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Pakistan. However, there are bright spots, and we must shine a light on them because that is what gives us hope. Where significant progress has been achieved, we see, for example, the Bahamas, Colombia, Jamaica, Laos, and the Philippines. And in another 19 countries, there are at least 40% of women in managerial positions, which means you don't necessarily have to be Western or affluent or powerful or a world leader to make that happen. It's your will and it's the leadership. So basically, although average progress on gender parity coming to education is relatively more advanced than in other aspects, there are still 44 countries in the world today where over 20% of women are illiterate. So these are some of the numbers that I am throwing at you just to give a global perspective. There are some very positive and I would say inspirational women leaders of corporations, of countries, women in parliament, women on the factory floor, all over the world. And we must look at them to remember. But I will leave you with one number. According to the UN in 2018, 94% of victims of human trafficking for sexual exploitation were females, both adult women and girls. 94% of all human trafficking cases in the world. So yes, we need to really seriously talk about gendered globalization and how to do it smartly and quickly, because there are many areas where women are still exactly where they were thousands of years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand on to Rich Verma. And Rich is the Vice Chairman and Partner at the Asia Group and familiar to many of you. Thank you, Rich.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here. And when I think of the Raisina Dialogue, I think of these big strategic foreign policy issues, a lot of discussions about hard power and clash of countries in the international system. But when I also think of the theme of this particular Raisina, about the world reorder, new geometries, fluid partnerships, and uncertain outcomes, you have to put gender parity and gender rights at the top of the issues that are shaping and driving the international system today. So I know we sometimes have a tendency to separate out these hard power and soft power issues, but gender rights and gender equality, I say to all the strategic thinkers out there, is just as important and just a top-tier issue as we think about the world's security. When I told my 13-year-old daughter I was going to be on this panel, she said, "Dad, don't end up mansplaining this issue to a lot of women." And I don't intend to do that. I thought I would just share some of my insights from government service and in the private sector. I think part of the reason I'm on this panel is that I worked for 2 female secretaries of state. I worked for Secretary Albright and for Secretary Clinton. They were not only my bosses, they were my role models, they were my sources of inspiration, they were my mentors, they were constant sources of learning for me. You know, we had 3 female secretaries of state. We had Secretary Albright, we had Condoleezza Rice, we had Secretary Clinton. Secretary Albright said her granddaughter came to her one day and said, "Grandma, I feel really bad for the little boys in my room, in my classroom." And she said, "Why do you feel bad for the boys?" And her granddaughter said, "Because they can never be Secretary of State. This is only a job that's held by women." Now, that is a great view of the world to have. And personally, in my own family, I've been blessed to learn from my 2 daughters, my wife, my 3 sisters, my mother, and my grandmother. And many of you have heard me talk about my family and their experiences, their migration from India to the United States in the early 60s, but I always cherish these opportunities to talk about my mother and my grandmother because they did so much and they persevered over so many obstacles. My mom and my grandma were the product of the partition. They settled in Jalandhar in Punjab in 1947 after a very difficult and very dangerous journey, carrying with them only the items that they could manage to travel with. And they started over like millions of other people. And my grandmother was a school teacher in a government girls' school across from a slum area in the Basti Sheikh neighborhood in Jalandhar. When I served as ambassador, I probably had no greater honor than going back to that school, which is still educating young girls, and girls with such hope and such promise for the future. I saw my grandmother's classroom. I saw her pay records, where she collected a couple of hundred rupees each month. And she was really a towering member of the community and a great mentor to my mother, who also became a school teacher and social worker and who trained at Gandhi's Sewagram ashram. And when I went back to Jalandhar in the summer of 2015, one of the most emotional experiences I had was the number of women in their 70s and 80s who came out to greet me and said it was because of your mother and grandmother that we stayed on the right track, and they helped us and they shaped us. And when I was able to travel around India during my tenure, and I went to all 29 states, and I made it a point to speak to young people, and I would see these young girls in difficult economic and social conditions, and I could just see the face of my mother and grandmother in those young girls. And I thought, we really need to be able to give these folks and give these young people a chance, give them the mentorship and the courage that were given to my mother and grandmother so that they could make it. Now, as a young kid, I also saw my mom as a new immigrant to the United States, and we settled in Western Pennsylvania. And this image is etched in my mind of my mother wading in her sari in the blowing and drifting snow of Western Pennsylvania for the bus to take her to work, where she was a special needs teacher. She didn't know anyone. She started over from scratch. Again, so I've been so blessed to have these kinds of role models in my life. But what I know from my personal and professional experience is that the obstacles that my mother and grandmother faced are unfortunately still prevalent in today's professional workforce. They are in our society, and we have to work really hard to try to overcome them. It's already been noted the vast majority of CEOs, corporate board memberships, politicians are dominated by men. Now, we have to change that not only because it's the moral thing to do, but Secretary Clinton used to remind us, she would say, look, including women in the workforce is not only good for them and their families, but in countries where women are equally included, poverty goes down, the gross domestic product of the country goes up, and companies with more women in upper management achieve higher profits. The same can be said for the international security system. We know that more women in leadership positions means more peace, less conflict, more sustainable and longer lasting outcomes. That's not just a moral judgment, that's what the data actually shows. Now, unfortunately, the 20th century, we had less than 1% of leaders of countries during the 20th century were women. We've got to do a much better job than that. Now, if I think about what's happened in the United States over the last 2 years outside of the election of President Trump, I would say the single biggest issue has been the resurgence of women in political life, both as voters and both as candidates. And it was mentioned about the congressional midterms, the unprecedented number of women that ran. Over 3,000 women were on federal and state ballots. 24% of the Congress is now composed of women. That's the highest ever. We obviously have our female Speaker of the House. 28% of state legislatures, that's the highest ever. The first 2 Native American women in the Congress, the first 2 Muslim women in the Congress, the youngest woman ever to serve in the Congress. So that was really historic, but we have a lot more to do. We have to do a lot more on our legal and regulatory framework. We have to continue to take down a lot of barriers that exist and stamp out those hidden biases that continue to set women back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I've just been doing deserves applause. I've just been doing a count in my head. I think there have been more female heads of state in South Asia than there have been in the entire Americas in my lifetime. So that's possibly something worth thinking about. I'd now like to pass over to Minister Irani. Thank you. I'll give you the 5-minute hand signal too, if that's okay.
Thank you, Kate. I'll be shorter than that. Given the advice Richard got this morning from his daughter, I had some from my son. He said, don't go too hard on the men and don't be ultra-feminist. But I think between our sons and daughters is the balance that we are hoping, which will ensure a certain outcome of gender parity. I join voices with my colleague and speaker on this dais, Ms. Isfahani, who says the gender bias is not to be viewed only from the perspective of culture. In fact, one of the biggest disservices we do to gender inequality is to say we as a nation are better than you as a culture or as a nation. I feel that as an Indian today, I can proudly say that for every Harvey Weinstein in the world, there is a Dr. Kalam who worked shoulder to shoulder with Tessie Thomas in the missile program of India. We can proudly say today that in our space program and our satellite program in ISRO, we celebrated the woman's power, potential, and talent. Yes, there are many who might presume that when it comes to education in India, women lag behind. But let me say, year after year, every Indian, when they open their newspapers or any media medium, find that when our school examination results come out, the girls outperform the boys. We can also take pride in the fact that as a culture, when we today in the global economy context speak about making environments safer for women to work in our culture we had a book called Arthashastra, which is a book many have researched on from the economic context, from context of administration, and found that hundreds of years ago in our country, in our culture, we had the prospects of how a king or an administrator should deal with a gentleman who misbehaves or inappropriately sexually assaults a woman who works from home. So the fact that gender justice was a part of our cultural discourse is something that needs to be reinforced on this dais. In fact, we proudly say that in the independence movement of any other country, you possibly would find this unique Indian identity of a woman strapping her son to her back, drawing a sword, mounting a horse, and jumping into battle. That was India, and that still is the Indian potential. But when we talk about global economies and we look at the digital economy as a future of economies and industries and societies, what troubles me, Kate, is how prepared are we as a gender, as a community, for what digital prospects have to offer. For instance, everybody who uses Siri and Alexa, if you look at the research behind it, people are asked, why would you use a female voice for Siri or Alexa? And you are told that market research says that they needed a voice of obedience, and hence, it is a female voice. So there is a neuroscience to gender inequality which says that your brain processes circumstances, events around you all day, and while we are focused on the macro picture, we in our families, in our communities, are confronted with situations where that bias is reinforced without many of us knowing. So while we look for a better future for our girls in technology, in science, we also need to ensure that our families and our boys do not have manifestation of that bias unconsciously in their environment every day. And while we look at opportunities of pay parity in our companies, we also need to see the impact of women leaders in companies and corporations. Because the question that begets this entire conversation is this, that if we as a world economy know that women in leadership positions in companies mean better profits, if we as a nation or as a conglomerate of nations know that participation enhanced as such of women on strategic platforms means peace, then pray tell why we as a world, as a global economy, are not setting things right. And I think that is a question that needs to be answered by all of us. One, which part of our circumstances, environment is subconsciously, once again, reinstating a bias? And I say this because there have been researchers, even in universities across the United States of America, where there's been found that if 2 resumes of a police chief's job is given to unsuspecting people to pick from, when they don't know the age or the gender of the candidate concerned, they always pick the resume which is heavy on educational qualifications. But the minute one told the persons picking that particular resume, which is a man and which is a woman, predominantly the choice for the chief of police went to the male candidate. Does that mean that all men are a part of the problem? No. It definitely means all men can be a part of the solution, and that is what I want to work at.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think this issue of the digital economy and the biases that are built into artificial intelligence is one that we're really going to have to guard against. Algorithms that search through CVs really do damage to female candidates because they incorporate all the biases associated with the existing workplace. I think the unconscious biases question is also a really interesting one. I'd be interested in people's thoughts on that. Women in leadership positions, if they exhibit strong opinions, if they disagree, or if they show anger, all of those things are negatively impact people's perception of them, whether the same behavior in men is considered a sign of strength and charisma. And I would just note on a personal matter, even though I have outperformed all the boys in my class in high school, without question, and I know that because I went to a school reunion soon, none of them were sexually harassed on a weekly basis from the day they left school until the day they were married. And I can safely say that that happened to me. Despite outperforming all the boys in my class, I still face weekly sexual harassment in my teens and 20s, and that has to end. I still keep all the windows locked if my husband is not in the house at night on a hot summer's day. These are the things that women live with every day, no matter how privileged they are. So I'm going to open to questions. I'd like to first see if there are any of the ORF young fellows in the audience who would have a question. Any young fellows would like to identify themselves? Is at the back that I can see? Are you that group at the back? Are you all the young fellows in the corner? Yes. Could a couple of you come forwards to the microphone, and then I'll take a couple of questions from the gentleman here and others who will identify themselves. Is the microphone going to the... Sorry? Oh, it's you. Okay, great. Thank you. Go ahead.
So
Could you identify yourself, name and organization, please? Thank you.
Test 1, 2, you hear me? My name is David Kostevich. I'm a German submarine skipper, and there are 2 female officers in my crew. Myself having a, traditionally speaking, quite masculine profession. My question to you would be, opening the armed forces for women, would you rather consider it at the end of the process of achieving gender parity, or shouldn't it rather be one of the first measures that a government should take to raise the incentive for young women to enter such masculine jobs, making them feel, hey, if I even can become a submarine officer or a general, I can achieve anything else in my country? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the questions in a group, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond to the ones that they feel most excited about. Another young fellow, if you could identify yourself, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ananta Gaur. So my question for the panel is that why is it that in the 21st century also, if we're looking at engendered globalization, are we talking about a very binary gender perspective, and where do we leave the trans women, trans men? A normal Google search will tell you that there are 63 genders. Of course, we can argue upon that. Facebook gives you 58 gender labels to choose from. Then why do we conform ourselves to just a very rigid gender binary perspective? So I'd like to know the panel's perspective upon that. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. And I'll take a final question from the young fellows, and then we'll open to the panel, and then we'll open to the floor. Thank you.
All right. My name is Peace. I'm a journalist from Nigeria. First of all, I just want to talk about the future of engendered globalization. When we'll talk about engendered globalization, we can't talk about it without mentioning Africa. Because in Nigeria, where I come from, statistics have shown that we have only 6% of women holding public offices in Nigeria since the return of democracy in 1999. And recent figures also from the National Institute for Education, Planning and Administration in Nigeria also shows that 5.5 million school-age girls are currently out of school. So at a time when Nigeria is about 39 days or less to the 2019 elections, and even for the future of Nigeria, how will the global world, or how will the world or the Western countries see that we have more percentage of women in political sphere and even in other parts of the economy in Nigeria?
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask the panel if you'd like to respond to any of those questions. Minister?
I just want to say to the gentleman who started the whole questionnaire, he, in his question, had a phrase, masculine job. I think jobs don't have a gender. It is the opportunity challenge which can be given a gender perspective. As somebody who had actually worked and supported women to have a permanent commission in the Indian Army through legal means, I'm of the opinion that given an equal opportunity to perform, given an equal opportunity to enhance their skills, it does not matter which segment of society, but when women are given that equal opportunity, they do rise purely on the basis of their talent to some of the highest echelons of power or positions of service. The challenge that we face is the entry point, which is equal for men and women. And I feel that irrespective of the segment that we work in, if that is a challenge that can be addressed. For instance, Kate had a personal declaration here about sexual harassment as CEO. How many female CEOs can actually publicly say this and then not be measured from a different perspective when they go back to their companies or back to their colleagues? So that in itself is a question that we need to answer, that at the workplace, when you have such a declaration that there has been some kind of either an assault or some kind of an unequal way of behavior towards a female CEO or any other woman in any position at work, then do we judge that lady after that proclamation on the basis of her talent, or does that proclamation itself then have a bias not only for that working woman but others also in that same organization? And insofar as while have only a very rigid perspective of gender, I think justice is about giving equal opportunity for everybody. The challenge has been that that equal opportunity has been denied to individuals just because they've been women. And that is the perspective, I think, with which we all sit here in discussion today.
Thank
Kate-
you. We'll
Kate,
go
if
this
I-
way along the panel.
Yeah,
Thank you,
just
Rich.
say a word about the U.S. military. I had the good fortune of starting my career in the U.S. Air Force. And for us in the United States, our experience in the U.S. military has been an incredibly egalitarian institution for many years. And I look at the senior women in leadership positions in the military, including here in Delhi. When I served as ambassador, the senior defense officer was a one-star general, General Robin Fontes, who was a star in the military. I think about one of our great role models, who's Indian-American astronaut, Sunita Williams, was a Naval Academy graduate, a fighter pilot, a helicopter pilot. Her picture is up on my son's wall, signed. When she came to the embassy, I've never seen such a crowd gather and so much excitement. And so I'm really proud of what our military has done. If the question is, should you be sequencing, does this come at the end of advancement for women, I would just kind of reject that notion. And I just think the military is such an important institution in societies, and having women play an equal and leading role in the military is critically important.
I think also I would just add to that, in policing, the role of women is absolutely essential. We see the prosecution of child abuse and sex crimes and other things go up very significantly, and improved relationships with the community and improved trust in the police when there are much more police women in a police force. Clara?
I was just going to a quick little thing to the young woman from Nigeria, just in terms of political empowerment. There can be no true political empowerment anywhere in the world until political parties are absolutely forced to do equal seats for men and women. And that does not mean reserved seats for women. That means equal seats. And there's a reason for this. Because what happens very often is the women who do get into parliament tend to be the daughter or wife or some relation of some powerful family, of some patriarchal structure. And so it has to be blind to those things. Tickets have to be awarded blind to those kinds of things, and parties have to look at each candidate as, in a way, aid blind, right? That the party pays the costs for people's elections, etc. So that you don't have to be rich to be someone to come up in politics and not have a strong man behind you. So that's just my personal take.
Thank you, Farah. Osler?
Yeah, just building on the question of access to the political sphere. I think this is just so important. I think the role of role models in all countries is not focused enough upon, and I think to ensure the legal and the political participatory rights of women all over the world is a fight that has to be taken again and again and again. And I think that having inspirational women at the top, as we were talking about, the American Secretaries of State, etc., are crucial in that. And just adding very quickly to the question of military women in the military and female submarine captains. In many countries, including in India and in the United States, the armed forces have been a social elevator. It's been one of the places where that has been open to people that have come from the lower echelons of society and been able to better themselves in these institutions. In different countries, different workplaces or organizations or companies have played this role, but I think the armed forces is, in many countries, such an agency. And that is why it's so crucial that the armed forces are open to women. And of course, with the same criteria as one would expect from men. But what we see is that women are able to meet these criteria and do the jobs just as well as men. And that is, I guess, my point here, that whether a submarine captain is male or female is not really all that important, as long as they're able to do the job and equip themselves in accordance with the standards of the organization.
Thank you. So I'm going to take the gentleman at the front. We'll have there's two gentlemen here near the microphones, and then we'll take another question from a young fellow, and then we'll wrap up the questions, and I'll ask the panel to make concluding remarks. Sir, you've been very patient. Thank you.
My name is Vinod Sehgal. I'm Executive Director, Eco Monitors Society, that deals with the demographic ecological interface. A very short question to any of the panelists. There have been two examples in the last century of emancipation of women in the twinkling of an eye. One was Turkey, Kemal Atatürk. Second was Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba. It still stands. Can these be replicated today? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the gentleman at the back?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Anirban, and I represent an organization called Dream a Dream. I'm proud to say that even our CEO is a woman. And just to ask a question to Smriti Irani ma'am, how can, we have talked about leadership, but how can we increase the women labor force in India? Because there are a lot of reasons which we have faced, like lack of transportation for women, for transition, and then again lack of residential facilities for women. And actually, even we have seen a decrease in the women labor force even after maternity once they come back. So what can, as a government, you can do which we can increase the women labor force in India? Thank you.
Thank you. And there was another gentleman at the back. No, sir, I think there was a man in the queue. I'm sorry about that. And then we'll ask the last young fellow, and then we'll wrap up the questions. Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to thank the chair for giving me this opportunity. My question, first of all, it starts with a suggestion, which is, I mean, we're seeing the number of panels that are there in the ORF, and there's just one related to engendered globalization, and there's very little, little related to diversity. So it's just a suggestion that I would really appreciate it if there were more panels related to diversity and to gender. My question basically is to Irani ma'am, and it's basically that we have the 108th amendment bill, which is the 33% reservation for women. And it's lapsed on multiple occasions in the past. And you being part of the legislature, I just wanted to know what keeps us from not passing it.
Thank you. And the lady over there?
Can you hear me? My name is Isha. I'm a journalist based in Germany, a country where teenagers today think that the word chancellor is synonymous to a woman leader because they haven't seen any other. But having said that, women in boardrooms and leadership roles in Germany, the number is very little. When we talk about the US, that's the only developed country in the world that does not offer any maternity leave. We are yet to see a women president from US. The World Economic Forum says that when we talk about gender pay gap in the West, it's going to take at least 200 years to close that gap. So my question is that though there are a lot of problems in the underdeveloped and developing part of the world, and there are lots of them, they're obvious problems, but when it comes to problems in the West, why is there an attempt to brush them under the carpet and not give them as much light as we normally give to problems in the Asia or Africa? Thank you.
That's not true. That's not true. I mean,
well, I can certainly tell you that in the UK, there's a lot of discussion about gender, but I think you're making a very interesting point about the emphasis of the international community as a whole, rather than perhaps local feminist movements, who I would say are equally exciting all over the world. I'm afraid, with the questions, turn to the panelists now so that they can respond. But I'm also going to ask the panelists at the end to leave the audience with an idea for an action that, in whatever sphere of life you are, wherever you have influence, an action that you can take to address gender equality when you go back to your place of work in the next few days. So if you could respond to this round of questions, please, and then also leave the audience with an action that you would like them to take. Thank you very much. Minister, you'd like to go ahead? Or should we start with Osla?
Wherever. Maybe we should let the man have the last word, so.
A few minutes.
There were 2-3 questions, two of them specific to me. In terms of women in the workforce, if you look at data, you will find that there are more women in the unorganized sector as in the organized sector. And the reason for that is that unorganized sector does not ensure equal pay, does not ensure maternity leave. And that is why we are, through policy, ensuring that more and more women come into the organized sector. As a Minister of Textiles, I can proudly say that 70 to 75% of the workforce in my industry is all women. And most of the industry has understood that if you ensure residence, if you ensure education, especially for these girls, you will have people who are wanting to stay with the company longer, learn or enhance their skills on their job, and actually end up increasing profitability and efficacy in production. That is something that we've already seen. The Mudra Scheme that you've all heard about, it is the first such initiative by the Prime Minister where entrepreneurs, and there was not a gender skew to it, but entrepreneurs were given capital through banks. One did not imagine the amount of women who would step forward, which means that there was a presumption that if it's a female entrepreneur, especially in villages or smaller cities, she would not know how to draw up a business plan, go talk to a bank manager, and then get capital for their venture. The fact today that close to 75% of those who have received loans, and there are 14 crore loans which have been processed, so close to 140 million loans processed, out of which 75% have gone only to female entrepreneurs. That speaks a lot about the latent entrepreneurial talent of Indian women. And I think that's where the key lies for exponential growth. That when women have an equal opportunity to have an entrepreneur opportunity, when they have equal access to capital, they do better for themselves and help employ more women and actually help put in more money into education and health of their families. That is one. I had the proud privilege, since you asked about reservation in politics, I had the proud privilege of being in Rajya Sabha when the bill was passed in Rajya Sabha. In fact, we were in opposition then, and the government at that time did not have the numbers. And in support of women in the country, we stood up and we supported the government then. Since then, we have time and again said that all political parties need to come to the forefront and help us pass this bill. That is an offer we have made time and again. We have not found many takers. In fact, today, while I'm addressing you, I'm returning to the House for one of the most historical constitutional amendments in our country, which is to give reservations to those who are economically weak across our country, irrespective of religion or community or gender. So I'm going to go after this to vote in favor of that. So that is another positive step that we are taking. But Kate, if we are to wrap up in this, I began my introductory remarks with regards to technology and algorithms, as you've added, who are unconsciously being participative in gender discrimination. We all recognize that artificial intelligence and biotechnology, when that is fused, at that cusp will lie a new frontier for the entire mankind. And what we need to prepare ourselves, our companies, our communities, our families, is for that exact moment for our daughters, for the women in our family and our societies. Are we ready only as consumers, or will we have more female scientists, more coders, more digital entrepreneurs who are of the fair gender? Is a question that we need to address at home. Because while I spoke about equal opportunity to enter into a field, if you look at data for female scientists around the world, they will tell you that 81% of women scientists say that there is a gender bias in the evaluation of their work. So while they enter and that work evaluation is something which is discriminated upon, that is where their trajectory gets curtailed. So if there is something that you can go back and find out why Siri is not in a male's voice or Alexa is in a male's voice, but also go back, if you can, through your companies, prepare the fair agenda for this explosion of fusion of biotechnology and artificial intelligence. If you can do that to our students, to consumers, and have more digital female entrepreneurs, I think that is something that times to come will thank us for.
Great comments, thank you. And I would just point people to the Global Entrepreneurship Report. It may surprise people, but actually the most entrepreneurial demographic is women between the ages of 55 and 64. And actually, the internet is offering huge opportunities for women to work in their home, work in rural settings, employ other women, and then sell their goods via the internet. So that piece of digital inclusion and entrepreneurship is also added to the issue of women in STEM is something that we should all focus on. Thank you very much. Rich, your answers and a final action point for the audience.
Sure, let me address the question about Western societies, and I know there was concern that there hasn't been a U.S. president who's a woman, and I can tell you that some of us worked very hard to see that that was trying to happen in the last election, and it did not happen. So we were pretty disappointed that didn't, but it will happen one day. Look, I don't think there's an effort to brush under the rug what happens in Western societies. I think what's happening is that we have adequate legal protection, we have advanced economies, but there are still so many obstacles to women entering the workforce on an equal basis, to advancement, and many of those are access to education, the cost of education, the cost of healthcare, the cost of childcare, which hit women disproportionately harder because of the multiple roles that they take on in society. And sometimes I think you're exactly right. We say, oh, we have the laws in place, so you're going to have equal ability and access to reach the top, but it's just not the case. And you pointed it out. The corporate boardrooms, the corporate C-suites are not adequately represented. When I think about kind of what we can do, I would just mention two things. One is just the leadership required and the courage required. And again, I think back to what President Obama did. He had more women in senior leadership positions in his government than in any U.S. government in the history. Secretary Kerry had 6 of 7 undersecretaries of state were women. So leadership is required and at the highest levels. And finally, I'd just say on the biases, we have to look at those biases not only in the workplace, in society, but in our families and communities as well. Because sometimes I think we have different expectations for girls as opposed to boys, and we need to be aware of those biases even when they're close to home.
Thank you, Rich. So we're losing people to the 1 o'clock session because we started 2 minutes late. I'm using my chair's privilege to extend us by 2 minutes. So Farron Oslo, if you could keep your remarks succinct. Thank you.
My closing idea for all of you basically is, because politics is in my blood and my blood runs with politics, my message to all of you, if you are employers, employees, self-employed, whatever it is, start some kind of training program for young graduates. Women, young graduates, and also, as we heard earlier, at least in the United States and in Western Europe, we are trying to look beyond the traditional gendered approach. So try and reach out to these young people and be their mentor. If each one of you does that, we are going to end up with, something going forward that is feasible and not very hard. You can think about it over lunch, but one person is all you need to mentor. In this day and age where we have this horrible, dangerous strain of populism all over the world, I don't need to name names or countries, but these populist male leaders are setting back women's rights and women's right to have rights because their entire base is rooted in patriarchy. I could just right now, I'll just name the president of the country I live in, President Donald Trump. He has taken and tried to take back the movement that has been led by millions of brave Americans over centuries. But we're fighting. But I will only name him. But remember one thing, if you come from a country with a populist leader, do your bit for young women. Because you need to do it, because these people will try and take away all your rights. That is who they are. They do not consider you equal. It's lip service.
Thank you, Farah. Osler.
Thank you so much. It was implied earlier on that I had somehow an idea of a hierarchy amongst states when it comes to equality. I do not. The point I was trying to make, and obviously failing to do so, was that globalization and modernity is very closely linked to equality, and we are all moving in this direction, but globalization in our times is unleashing a host of troubles and concerns and anxieties in societies. Some feel that things are moving too rapidly, and these challenges are very much individual. What is happening in the United States is very different from what's happening in Norway and what is indeed happening in India. When it comes to the one takeaway, much is emphasis on women's role in capturing the command heights of society to enter into the boards and to become ministers. I would make a plea for the 99%, and I think to focus upon women's rights to education. It's not a battle that is already won, and I think we cannot forget that millions of women, hundreds of millions of women, are denied their basic right to learn to read and to go to school, and to be given the opportunity to get the foot on the first rung of the ladder. Whether they succeed or not, I think that is up to all of us to provide the incentives and the frameworks that is so they are not discriminated on the way up. But I think education is the most important, and it's a battle that is not yet won. We need to continue focusing on this.
Thank you. And I would just sum up by saying, as a mother of two little boys, just how quickly these things set in the playground. And so I am consciously never going to tell my little boys not to cry, ever. And I consciously do not compliment little girls on looking pretty, ever. So those are two little actions that I've taken on myself to deal with my own reflexes. I think we should give the panel a round of applause for such an engaging talk.